Rent-to-own is when a tenant signs a rental agreement or lease that has an option to buy the house or condo later, usually within 3 years. The option of renting to own can benefit people who at the time do not have the money or credit to buy a home. In this video we will provide information about renting to own, its impact on the family's budget, statistics on the topic, long and short-term impact on families and recommendations. Rent-to-own, also known as lease-to-own, allows you to rent a dwelling with an option to buy the home within a specific period. A portion of your monthly rental payments will go toward a down payment. With a traditional home purchase and sale, the buyer and seller complete the purchase more or less immediately after agreeing to terms at closing. Under a rent-to-own agreement, the buyer and seller agree to the possibility of a sale at some point in the future. Ultimately, the renter-buyer decides if the transaction will actually take place. In the meantime, the seller receives payments, and a portion of those payments usually reduces the money needed to buy the house at a later date. The general outline of renting to own a house is as follows. The renter agrees to lease the house for a set amount of time, usually 1 to 3 years. The renter pays an upfront fee called an option fee, which is typically 1 to 5% of the home's purchase price. The fee is usually non-refundable, but part or all of it can be applied to the down payment. The renter may also pay a higher monthly rent, but a portion of the rent will go into a fund that is later used for a down payment. The contract locks in the purchase price of the home. The renter can purchase the home on or before the lease's expiration date. Advantages for the family's budget are, it gives renters the opportunity to build their credit and save for a down payment while also building home equity. It gives renters an escape plan if a family member loses their job or if the home's value drops. Disadvantages for the family's budget are, if renters are not prepared to buy the home at the end of their lease, they may lose their option fee and portion of their rent set aside for their down payment. Renters will miss out on the current low interest rates for mortgages and may face higher interest rates at their end of their lease. Renters may be forced to pay a higher than market price for their home if the value of the home decreases during the lease period. Price to rent is a statistic that measures the relative affordability of purchasing and renting in a housing market. For instance, in a real estate market where, on average, a home worth $100,000 could rent for $500 a month, the price-to-rent ratio is 16:67. The formula for the calculation is $100,000 per 12x $500. An option to buy. At the beginning of any rent-to-own transaction, the buyer typically pays the seller an option premium, which is often around 5% of the ultimate purchase price, although it can certainly be higher or lower. This payment gives the buyer the right or option, but not the obligation, to buy the home at some point in the future. No refunds. The initial premium payment is non-refundable, but it can be applied to the purchase price, and if the buyer ever buys the home, they won't have to come up with as much cash. Larger option payments are risky for buyers. If the deal doesn't go through for whatever reason, there's no way to get that money back. The seller typically gets to keep any premium payments after a rent-to-own transaction ends. Purchase price. The buyer and seller set a purchase price for the home in their contract. At some point in the future, usually between 1 and 5 years, depending on negotiations, the buyer can purchase the home for that price, regardless of what the home is actually worth. When setting the price, a price that's higher than the current price is not uncommon, otherwise, the seller is better off just selling today. If the home has gone up in value faster than expected, things work out in the buyer's favor. If the home loses value, the renter probably won't buy the home, partly because it might not make sense, and partly because the renter might not be able to qualify for a large loan with a high loan-to-value ratio. Buyers usually apply for a mortgage when the time comes to purchase the home. Monthly payments. The buyer, renter also makes monthly payments to the seller. Those payments serve as rent payments because the seller still owns the property, but the renter typically pays a little bit extra each month. The additional amount is usually credited to the final purchase price, so it reduces the amount of money the buyer has to come up with when buying the home. Again, the extra rent premium is non-refundable. It compensates the seller for waiting around to see what the buyer will do. The seller can't sell the property to anyone else until the agreement with the renter ends. Short-term and long-term impacts on the family can depend on which rent-to-own agreement you choose to sign. A lease purchase contract legally binds the buyer to purchase the home when the lease expires. It also binds the seller to go through with selling the home. Overall, when the buyer and seller sign the contract, both parties must abide by the contract. The other rent-to-own agreement is the lease option contract. This contract gives the buyer the option to purchase the home when the lease expires. If the buyer chooses not to buy the home, they can walk away without any obligations to continue paying rent or to buy the home. Moreover, long-term and short-term impacts on the family can also deal with financial issues or with the emotional toll on the family. The short-term impacts include the stress of moving to a new home, spending money on new home necessities, uprooting children, possibility of leaving behind family. If a lease option contract was signed, you are under no obligation to buy the home when the lease expires. If buyer chooses not to buy the home, then you must move again. You become the owner of the home. If a lease purchase contract was signed and the buyer did not save enough money for down payment or has other financial issues, the buyer is still under obligation to purchase the home. For any reason you do not want to purchase the home, then you are breaching the contract and must remedy the breach. The long-term impacts are, families have the chance to save money for a down payment for their home when contract is over, allows time to boost their credit, allows families to get their finances in order. If a lease purchase contract was signed, you must purchase the home once the lease expires. You become the owner of the home. If a lease purchase contract was signed and the buyer did not save enough money for down payment or has other financial issues, the buyer is still under obligation to purchase the home. If you do not want to purchase the home, then you are breaching the contract and must remedy the breach. Rent-to-own, also known as lease-to-own, allows you to rent a dwelling with an option to buy the home within a specific period. A portion of your monthly rental payments will go toward a down payment. With a traditional home purchase and sale, the buyer and seller complete the purchase more or less immediately after agreeing to terms at closing. Under a rent-to-own agreement, the buyer and seller agree to the possibility of a sale at some point in the future. Ultimately, the renter-buyer decides if the transaction will actually take place. In the meantime, the seller receives payments, and a portion of those payments usually reduces the money needed to buy the house at a later date. The general outline of renting to own a house is as follows. Deciding to rent to own is as big of a decision as buying a home. In a lease purchase agreement, you technically buy the home. And though you have the option to purchase with a lease option, you are still committing to the purchase because some of your rent money will go towards that. And you'll lose that money if you decide not to purchase the home. That's why it's important to treat the rent-to-own agreement with the same caution as a traditional home purchase. To protect yourself from a few common rent-to-own scams, ensure that property taxes have been paid to date and there are no liens on the property. Ensure the landlord actually owns the home and can legally rent to you before you give them any money. You can do this by reviewing a recent tax bill, the title to the property, or a recent mortgage statement. Before you sign the agreement and pay the option fee, have a real estate attorney review the agreement and explain your rights as a renter. Make sure you understand what happens if there are any missed or late payments. Take some time to make sure this is the right decision for you at this time. If you cannot qualify for a mortgage now, make sure you'll be able to by the end of your lease. Do you have a plan in place for raising your credit or saving for a down payment? Will you be able to pay off some of your other debt or become more financially responsible by then? Along with thinking about your future, consider your present. Do you have enough money to pay a higher rent? Are you in a good financial position to make all of your payments on time? Have a chat with a financial advisor who understands your financial situation. They'll be able to help you determine if this is the right move to make right now and help set you up for a successful rent-to-own experience.